Thomas Frank is a great cultural, intellectual historian. Everybody knows him from What's the Matter with Kansas. Basically, turned out to be totally right on the issue of conservatism, Kansas, the right, and how it played on both populist economic issues. The problem is, by 2010, things had changed one more time. And his book now, Pity the Billionaires, is sort of a look at, in some ways, the comeback of the right in the 2010 elections. So why don't we start there, Thomas? By the way, Thomas has a PhD in history, I think, University of Chicago, and from Kansas, from Overton Park, is it?
Or I hate to admit
Mission
it.
Hills?
Mission Hills.
Mission Hills.
It's a long story. It's a very amusing story.
Go ahead.
And if y'all want to hear
we have
it.
Dan Glickman here.
He's heard it already.
Kansas.
Yes, that's where I'm from, though. It's a suburb of Kansas City.
No, we know all the suburbs of Kansas City. They're good.
Okay.
And love them all, including Kansas City, Kansas. The other Kansas City. But anyway, why don't we start then with the why the right came back in 2010 after most people said the 2008 elections.
Yeah. Well, it's like my colleagues in pundit land, and at the time I was a practicing pundit for the Wall Street Journal, and basically just across the board, people, the pundit class looked out over the landscape in 2008 and said, the defeat of McCain, combined with the scandals of the Bush administration, this failed war in Iraq, very unpopular war in Iraq, and the complete economic meltdown. This spelled the end of conservatism. It's not only were its sort of ethical claims in ruins, after something like the Abramoff scandal and the career of Tom DeLay, but its great economic idea. To deregulate, roll back the rules, this reverence for free markets, which has dominated economic conversation since I was in high school, that entire way of doing things had been discredited and was, in fact, lay in ruins at our feet. And so the argument was that the Republican Party had to become moderate. There's lots of different pundits that made this argument. The Republican Party had to become moderate. It had to, purge the conservatives. They had to walk back from the cliff and that sort of thing. And ironically, the Republicans did exactly the opposite. Very interesting move. They didn't, elevate the moderates to positions of power. They purged those guys, and they embraced markets, and they declared that where we had really gone wrong was in not letting markets be free enough, that there had been this sort of residual interference in markets. True conservatives had never really got their turn. And so we needed to double down on the policies of the last 30 years rather than turn our back on them. And when I remember the sort of the genesis of this book, of Pity the Billionaire, was when I realized that this was going to be the strategy of the Republican Party. Speaker Boehner, he wasn't speaker at the time, but John Boehner was sort of making this clear. And my friends and I saying, first of all, this looks like political suicide. And second of all, though, what if it isn't? What if they're successful? What about their country? I mean, don't they care? To actually advocate doing this after what they've done. How can this be happening? And so that was my reaction. And I also, a light went on in my head. I was like, this will succeed. This is a strategy that's going to, and it did succeed. We all know the story. The Tea Party movement shows up on the scene with this sort of vision of an even more, even stronger, even greater dedication to markets. This understanding of markets almost as a religious thing, as a culture war all of its own. And then the great success of 2010, the shellacking that President Obama took. And that's, in my mind, a really interesting story. And I mean, a highly ironic story, the kind of, we're living in an ironic age, though, an age when everything, it seems, is upside down. And and we're just about to get a good taste of that tonight from Michigan.
How do you think Michigan illustrates that?
Well,
I mean, Santorum Romney illustrates that, I should say.
the you know, a guy like Rick Santorum is not someone that I would have ever thought would have a chance, you know, in politics again, after his own defeat in 2006. And just today, I happened to look on the Wall Street Journal website, and he had an op-ed outlining, I think it was his 10-point economic program. Now, this is a man that, you understand, is representing himself as the voice of blue-collar America, which has been very effective for him, especially given a guy like Romney, who's like, yeah, a couple of Cadillacs, you know, own a couple of these teams, you know, I bet you 10 grand on that one. You know, he's coming up against this guy, and it's a hoot, right? Okay, so I'm reading his 10-point plan. And I don't know if you've spent much time around actual blue-collar voters or gone to union halls or anything like this, but I guarantee you one thing they hate above all other, you know, all of the political deeds of the last 20 years is NAFTA. Oh my God, do they hate it? Okay? So I'm looking down Rick Santorum's list of 10 things that he's going to do for America, and like number 2 is more deregulation, but number 6 or 7 or whatever it is more free trade treaties, right? That's what we need. And blue-collar Michigan is set to, or a large part of it anyway, if what the pollsters are telling us is true, is set to vote for this man. Mm-hmm. So that is ironic. That's upside down. That's not what you would expect.
So go back to the rise of the Tea Party. Did the Tea Party, I mean, in your book you talk about them getting somewhat co-opted by small business and big business. Horrible.
Well, I think they were sort of born co-opted and became more authentic as the years went by, or as the months went by. Well, I happened to go to the first Tea Party rally, which was not all that far from here, down in Lafayette Park. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned I was a columnist for the Wall Street Journal at the time. And another dumb little fact about my life, all my life I have read novels and social criticism of the 1930s. This is my period. Mm-hmm. I was born to write about 2008, 2009. Yeah. And one of my favorite books is Edmund Wilson. It's called The American Earthquake. It's a series of essays, of vignettes. He did reporting around the country from scenes of sort of economic ruination and protest, more importantly. So, you know, coal miners going on strike, the guys building Hoover Dam going on strike, this kind of thing. And he went around the country writing these beautiful, you know, very well-observed vignettes of economic protest. And I wanted to do something like that. And my friends all knew that this is what I was looking for. And somebody calls me up and says, Tom, I've got your economic protest, first one, here we go. Mm-hmm. And I look into it and I go down to it. It's the first Tea Party rally. It's about a week after Rick Santorum's famous rant from the floor of the Chicago.
Santelli, but yeah.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah. So, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right. Santorum didn't get the rant on TV
that's right.
that early.
Rick Santelli, the CNBC announcer, did his famous rant on the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade. And about a week later, they had the first Tea Party rally here in D.C., and I went to it. And it was all the usual suspects. It was guys from various, you know, libertarian and conservative magazines, people from various pressure groups, you know, guys from think tanks, lobbyists, a lot of guys wearing their CPAC tags because CPAC was going on at the same time. And I went to it, and you know, I was like, oh, come on. Mm-hmm. You know, I know who these guys are. I know what this is. This is this is AstroTurf. This is a trick. You know, Joe the plumber was there. You know, it was that kind of thing, and yet, okay, and yet, this is February of 2009, and you remember the mood in the country. People were so angry. This is the Wall Street bailouts had been going on. The sort of high point hadn't been reached yet, the AIG bailout, which made people so angry. But everybody was furious about what was happening. I mean, and there were scary headlines on the front page of the paper every day. GM declares bankruptcy. I mean, unthinkable things were happening. And so I went to this thing, and I was in you know, a real mood myself. And I remember there was a protester there holding a sign. You know, maybe someone from, you know, the Cato Institute or something. I don't know who they were. I have no idea. But the sign said, "Let the failures fail," and it had these very, like the Goldman Sachs logo, the AIG logo, and I was like, why not? That's exactly right. Let those guys fail. Now, you think about it for 30 seconds and you realize that's not the best solution to the problem at the time. But it was an answer that was different than what both parties were giving us at the moment, which is bail everybody out. Everybody gets our money. No strings attached, or very few strings attached. And it really, even though I knew that this was all grass, this was AstroTurf, it had an appeal to me. I'm sorry, I got off the subject, didn't I?
No, but didn't it become real grass after a while?
Yes, I feel like it did, because I went to a number of other Tea Party rallies over the years, and the later ones were more, I don't want to say they were spontaneous, everything was planned, of course, but it was people who had nothing to do with the Beltway, the usual Beltway suspects. People who had nothing to do with these pressure groups or think tanks or lobby shops, who were there because they were legitimately angry. Yes, they came in on buses, but they weren't part of the sort of the
How
DC.
do they echo the ones of the 30s?
That's actually, this is a really interesting point. This is the realization that I came to after looking at the protest movements of 2009 and 2010, is that they were deliberately, or that they were echoing the 1930s, and in some cases they were deliberately echoing the 1930s. And sort of the classic example that I like to cite is, do you remember Glenn Beck? Everybody's already forgotten Glenn Beck, I've found, but just a few years ago everybody was talking about Glenn Beck, the Fox News host. And when the Tea Party movement got started, he launched his own version of it called the 9/12 Project. And it was like he was going to slap a proprietary label on the Tea Party movement or something like that. And I watched and rewatched and watched many, many times the episode of his program where he launched the 9/12 Project, as he put it. And after watching it and then trying to describe it in print, typing it up, I realized that what I was actually describing was a movie, a Frank Capra movie called Meet John Doe. Do y'all remember this movie? It's about a fake grassroots movement, these political clubs set up around the country by a broadcast superstar who talks a lot about suicide. And there were these very curious similarities between that and it became clear to me that was the
If I may say, the one sort of criticism I had of the book when I read it was so much focus on Glenn Beck, who just seemed, a couple of chapters it seemed, maybe I'm wrong, but...
Well, I use him as an illustration.
Well, but he seemed like a passing flash of somebody who was self-promoting and disappeared on us.
Doesn't he have a bestseller right now?
I don't know that.
I am pretty sure he has a book about George Washington.
Okay, well, let me ask it as a question. Is he influential? Does he matter?
Oh, does he matter anymore?
And do these people come up out of talk radio, make a flash, get on the bestseller list? And is that?
No, I could be wrong about his book being on the bestseller list.
Yeah,
I saw it in a bookstore earlier, and so he was at the time though.
But there are a bunch of these.
He was but he was really the face and the voice of that moment. Remember, he was on the cover of Time magazine. And the cover of the New York Times Sunday magazine, and there were two biographies of him that appeared. One of them by the Washington Post guy, Dana, what's his name?
Milbank?
Yes, yeah. And another one that came out just a few months before that. And he was really the face of the moment. And that occurred to independently of those people saying that. When I would go to Tea Party rallies, I watched Glenn Beck's program a lot, for the reasons I just gave. But when I would go to his rallies, or not his rallies, when I would go to Tea Party rallies and you'd talk to people or you'd hear what people were saying from the podium, they would always be echoing points that Glenn Beck had made. And there's a lot of very idiosyncratic things that he does, and he alone does, as far as I can tell, that, for example, his take on American history, where Woodrow Wilson is this kind of devil figure, that's strictly his doing. And you encounter this everywhere now. This is everywhere you go. You run into this.
Maybe everywhere you go. Some of us the Woodrow Wilson.
Hey, look, okay, maybe not in Aspen.
Yeah,
What if?
demonization of Woodrow Wilson is a small pocket of.
By the way,
people,
and that's one of these very strange little moments of very 1930.
Right.
Hating Woodrow Wilson is a very 1930s thing to do. This is John Dos Passos.
Right.
You know, and I'm a huge fan of Dos Passos. I realize it's completely a strange thing for someone of my generation to be.
Better than Glenn Beck. Yeah.
But there's the points of comparison with the 1930s are, I mean, it goes on and on and on. You have things like Dick Armey's group, Freedom Works, where they read. Well, they read Saul Alinsky, of course. This is lots of people do that on the right, do that now. But they also read a book about the strategies of the Communist Party in Great Britain, and the idea being that these are strategies that we should be replicating. And in fact, the similarities between the current sort of economic right, Tea Party right, libertarian right, and the Communist Party in the 1930s are uncanny. I mean, they both sort of wandered into this kind of world of utopian, this vision of economic utopia that is so strong that it kind of warps their perceptions of reality.
The reason I asked about Glenn Beck, because this is what I think, was for the comparison to the 30s and looking at, say, a Father Coughlin character who is, I would say, quite similar. I may be wrong. And the differences in similarities between then and now.
Beck is a gold bug, and Coughlin was a silverite.
Similar. I'm into platinum, but that's a different issue.
Yeah. Beck's the 30s figure that he probably pays homage to. He's explicitly disavowed anything having to do with Father Coughlin. He doesn't like. Father Coughlin was an anti-Semite. Pretty openly, and obviously that's poison nowadays. And but Beck is a fan of Orson Welles, and I was surprised to discover this. He mentions it in one of his earlier books, and that didn't make a lot of sense. I'm a fan of Orson Welles. I love Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons. And it didn't make any sense to me until I guess maybe I did overdo it with Glenn Beck. I was looking at these photos of him that he chose for the book. And he's got one of these photos, and I'm looking at it, and I'm looking, and I'm looking, and I'm looking, and I'm like, dang, that picture's really familiar. Why is that picture familiar? And it shows him at a microphone in a radio studio, and it says he's he's making the first radio drama to appear in many years, and he's got his headphones on, and he's got one, I can't do the pose, but he's got one hand, like this, and the other, anyhow, I don't remember. But I went back and looked up pictures of Orson Welles doing
War of the Worlds.
War of the Worlds. It's exactly the same pose. And then that's when the nickel dropped. Glenn Beck is doing War of the Worlds every night.
Well,
that's that onrushing doom. He calls his studio the Doom Room. Every day, it's a different vision of the end of the world, coming right around the corner at us.
And both of them were faking it and entertainers. But did Glenn Beck?
But Orson Welles admitted it, right? He's like, that was just a drama.
But doesn't Glenn Beck know that?
No.
That he's faking it.
Oh, that he knows that he's faking it.
That he's putting on a persona.
That would be hard to say. I've never met the man. I can't get into his deepest soul. I would suspect that at some point, that at some level, he does believe what he's saying. Okay. Although it would be frustrating, to be predicting hyperinflation for what, 4 years now? It never happens.
No, I was wondering to what extent these are showmen. Get to Obama, if you would. Do you think instinctively he's a populist who got pushed towards the Larry Summers side, or is he instinctively a liberal who has to occasionally use populist rhetoric?
I think he's a centrist. I think he's straight out of the. He's not in the Bill Clinton mode, because Bill Clinton, I think, could do populism and found it very easy, natural. Well, he was the natural, as they say. And I don't think that Obama finds, I don't think that he's comfortable with it. I think that Obama was my state senator when I lived in Chicago, and I used to meet him, you see him at house parties, and we all, he has that line about how people project their ideas onto him, and I know that was true in my case. But, we all thought, what a great man, he's going to be president someday, because he's so, you meet him, he's so brilliant. He's such an amazing public speaker. You know, he's the kind of guy, he walks into a room and everybody knows he just walked into the room. He has that kind of charisma. But when he came to Washington in 2009 and was talking about a grand bargain with the Republicans, and was talking about, you know, there are no, you know, his famous speech at the '04 convention, there are no red states, there are no blue states, you know, we're the United States. I myself used to brush that rhetoric off. And I thought he would rise to the occasion that was presented in 2009 and be a kind of Franklin Roosevelt figure. And instead, it turns out that, you know, and I thought that all his sort of bipartisan talk was just so much ornament, that he would, you know, that's what every politician in America, for as long as I've been alive, talks about that, how we have to come together, the spirit of civility, you know, reach across the aisle and be bipartisan. You know, it means nothing. And he came here, and I think he really believes that stuff. That, for him, that's not ornament, that is the essence. And, you know, he really thinks that differences of opinion are, well, that there's something illegitimate about it. Now, I want to take a step back here. One of the figures in an earlier book, I wrote a book called The Wrecking Crew a while ago, and there was, this came out in 2008. And in it, I had a chapter about what was called the New Right back in the 1970s. And they're a very interesting bunch of people, Howard Phillips, Richard Viguerie, a couple of others. And Howard Phillips had a very famous quote that people used to throw around back then in the 70s, and have largely forgotten about since then, which was organized discontent. That's what the New Right did. We organized discontent. And that line has always really struck me, because that seems like something that you would hear from the IWW or something like that. And yet that's what you see going on here in America, right? It was the Tea Party movement organizing discontent. Rick Santorum organizing discontent. Get out there, get people mad. And you look at someone like President Obama, and he is very uncomfortable with discontent, or he was up until he's changed his tune here in the last couple of months, and I think he's changed his tune very wisely. Maybe his famous speech in Osawatomie. And but up until then, he seemed to me like a man who was exactly the opposite of that, had no interest in organizing discontent, you know, thought that there's something wrong with discontent. And I think he missed a lot of opportunity. I mean, to me, very obvious opportunities in this, you know, in the spirit of bipartisanship and statesmanship, accepting the Bush administration's bailout plan, for example, rather than doing something like what Franklin Roosevelt did with his bailout.
Do you think it was just because he accepted it, or do you think he believed it?
I think he believes it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he believed his bailout plan.
Well, look, you know, truth be told, those decisions were made in a huge hurry. You know, and Obama almost certainly did not have a lot of a hand in, you know, telling Hank Paulson what to do. Now, he did vote for the TARP, but then once he came into office
and supported it,
that's right, and so did McCain. And, you know, and it was bipartisanship, and it was one of those extremely frustrating moments. You know, everything was moving too fast. By the way, I'm going to get off the subject here, but one of the things that you know, that while I was doing my research for Pity the Billionaire, one of the subjects that just, I mean, it kept coming up and kept coming up were the bailouts. This is, for the Tea Party movement and for the revitalized right generally, this is the sort of trump card. This is the ace in the hole. This is the, you know, we were against the bailouts, they say. Remember I told you about that sign that I saw at the very first Tea Party rally. And they, you remember the Republican, what were they called? The Republican group in the House that voted against the TARP and in fact torpedoed it the first time around. And caused the stock market to fall 700 points the next day. But they now, this is their sort of the feather in their cap. This is their shining moment. They were against the bailouts from day one, and they're very proud of this. And so I decided to do some research on the history of bailouts. And of course, the Tea Party movement presents their opposition to it as this is we're making a stand in favor of free markets. Bailouts are a violation obviously of the spirit of free markets. If you really truly believe in free markets, then of course you're opposed to bailouts. And so the answer to something like the TARP is to, you know, to rededicate ourselves to the spirit of free markets. Fine. So I went back and did the research, and you know, the first thing that you discover, and this is very obvious, is that there have been many, many bank bailouts over the last 30 years. President Reagan bailed out Continental Illinois. Citibank has been bailed out by various means more than once. And so not only did conservatives do bailouts, but conservatives also accepted bailouts. The president of Citibank was Walter Wriston, you recall, who was one of the sort of the big thinkers of the kind of free market. You remember this book that he wrote in the early 90s? Yeah. And he had no problem. Well, of course he had a problem with bailouts in publicly, but he had no problem with Citibank getting helped out when it needed it. But you go back further, and there were loads of bailouts in the Hoover administration. Now, I didn't know this. This wasn't discussed by our pundits in 2008 when we were having our very short debate over bailouts. It wasn't a debate that went on very long, but there were lots of bailouts in the 30s. That was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that Herbert Hoover set up. And it was criticized for exactly the same reasons as the bailouts are today, namely cronyism. I mean, incredible, rampant cronyism. The head of Hoover's bailout agency at one point quit, went back to Chicago to take over his old bank, and a few weeks later came and demanded a bailout and got one, right? And this is at a time when the public school teachers in Chicago hadn't been paid for 2 years or something like this. It was, it was obscene, and everybody in America was furious about this, outraged about it. And what did Franklin Roosevelt do? Did he, he was campaigning against Hoover at the moment. Did he say, well, in the spirit of bipartisanship, blah, 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 I'll accept this strategy and we'll continue doing exactly the same thing? Of course not. This is one of his most famous speeches, is about how we bailed out the people at the top and let the foot soldiers of our economic army, we just ignored them. And this is one of the things that totally ruined Herbert Hoover, was his bailouts. When Roosevelt got in, you guys who know about the 30s, you know that he kept the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and in fact made it much bigger. But he did the bailouts in a much different way. It was entirely different when Roosevelt was in charge. They would routinely fire the management at the banks they bailed out. Just get rid of these guys, who'd been gambling with the public's money. They capped salaries. I mean, they were invasive to a degree that would be, completely unacceptable today. They would go into cities where the banks had gone bust, and they'd say, well, we don't approve of you. We're starting a new bank here. They actually did this. The federal government, I believe it was in Detroit, went in and started an all-new bank. They tried to bail out the economy from the bottom up instead of.
And that's what Obama should have done?
He should have at least considered it. I mean, it should have been part of the debate, and it wasn't even. We didn't even talk about it. I mean, to this day, I think I'm the only. This is the British edition. I'm the only one to talk about it, as far as I know.
And is that because his economic team was basically Wall Street oriented?
Yeah, and I think they also don't. There are so many aspects of history that are really unknown to us. I often think about records that never made the leap from 78 to 33, or of course to a CD, and now to MP3. And there's all sorts of aspects of the 1930s that never made the leap to the internet. If you want to know about them, you have to dig. And I don't mean you have to dig far. You just have to go to the library. It's not hard, but we don't do it anymore. And this is something that I come across again and again and again when I write about the 30s. I get this response. It's like, no. If you go on the internet and Google any aspect of the Roosevelt administration, you'll immediately come across people saying, talking about the tyranny it was that he took us off the gold standard, or how unemployment never came down while Roosevelt was president. And the New Deal didn't do anything to help the economy in the 1930s. All of these things are completely wrong. And that's what that's the consensus opinion on the internet, though.
Speaking of the internet, do you think that the rise of the blogosphere in the past 15 years and others has helped or hurt the discourse that way?
Well, look, it's a huge help for me. I mean, it's so easy to research things. I want to look up something that Rick Santorum said. I just remember a little snippet of it. Boom, I can get it like that. And but look, our world has changed. I mean, you and I, wrote for magazines and newspapers.
Right.
That world is coming to an end. And I mean, let's hope Harper's Magazine. I write a column for Harper's Magazine. I don't know if you know this.
One that's been around for 150 years. The Easy
That's
Chair.
right. That's right. The Easy Chair is the longest running column in American journalism.
Wow.
So
I
since
knew
the
it had been around
18, it's pre-Civil War.
150. Yeah.
And
who were your predecessors in the Easy Chair?
Lewis
Leave
Lapham is the
Lewis.
let's see. Who's the guy that wrote 1848 Year of Decision? Bernard DeVoto is the most famous one.
But not like Oliver Wendell Holmes or something. We don't.
God, didn't Howells write it?
Howells, William Dean Howells.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I don't even like to talk about that because it's like
TRB,
I can't believe that I'm
well.
sitting in the same chair as those guys, but.
Yeah, it is true that the current digital age, it's hard for magazines like Harper's that for 200 years ago had reasoned discourse.
No, we're sticking to it, and I don't know if you all have picked up a copy of Harper's lately. Sure. I hope you do, but I'm very proud of it. I mean, the quality of the writing and the editing is, I mean, it's very high,
right. And
this is something that you just don't find obviously, that you don't find on the internet anymore. It's it's becoming. It's just something that doesn't happen.
Let me open it up. Dan Glickman from Kansas, come on.
Well, thank you for putting Kansas on the map for any reason whatsoever. Bill Clinton once had an interesting line. He said, "Strong and wronged." He said, "Strong and wrong will almost invariably defeat weak and right." And I wonder how, so this goes to the question of leadership. More than even ideology, and when the two combine themselves, when strong combines itself with the ideology, it can have a powerful thing. It strikes me in the Santorum-Romney race is a little bit like that. Strong, Santorum, versus weak, Romney. That's my perception of looking at these people. I could be wrong on that. But from the standpoint of Obama, the minute he switched from weak to strong, his numbers began to improve rather significantly. And it strikes me how much personal leadership has to do with the things that you're talking about. It's more than just ideology. It's having leaders who are really willing to step out and be strong.
Oh, that's totally true. That's absolutely right. Now, did you say strong and wronged with a D on the end?
No, just wrong.
Incorrect,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because I like the idea of strong and wronged with a D on the end, because that's
the
look,
politics
that's what
of resentment.
That's what we're talking about. We're talking about a party that has traditionally represented the strong, the well-to-do, that comes to us with this sort of extreme grievance. Look at a figure like Sarah Palin. Her entire career is about being a victim. Okay, she has been wronged. The biography of her that came out last year was called. You probably had this guy in here to speak. It was called The Persecution of Sarah Palin. And that's like every time I see her face on the TV, I know what's coming next. They're going to talk about how someone's been mean to her. She speaks for the strong and has been wronged. But I see what you're saying. I'm sorry. I took away from that's just how I misheard what you said.
I'm curious, given your worldview.
And maybe introduce yourself, if you would.
I'm Hans Orson. Given your worldview, how were you able to keep a job with the Wall Street Journal?
Well, the Journal hired me. They knew full well what they were getting, and I think that's what they wanted. My feeling is that they wanted a liberal on their op-ed page, and I delivered that. By the way, I loved writing for them. It was very hard work. Doing a weekly column is tough business.
Your life was never in danger.
Well, look, it was in danger from overwork. I don't know if you are a journal reader, but I would polish those columns. I mean, I would work and work and work on those things, and I would finish one and then immediately start another. And that was tough. That was very hard.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I want to take you back to something I thought. My name is Meryl Seacrest. I want to take you back to something I thought you were going to talk about, which interests me a lot, and it comes out of what's the matter with Kansas. Can you elaborate on this thought of yours? What is still the matter with Kansas?
Well, it's funny. It gets worse. It feels like it gets worse every few years. Kansas now has they've purged all the Democrats from our legislative our delegation to Washington. It's 100% Republican now. They obviously we had a Democratic governor and she's gone, and it's not just a moderate Republican. For years we had moderate Republican with Sam Brown back. There's two factions in the Republican Party there, essentially two different parties, and they fight. And the conservatives have pretty much triumphed in every way. The only place where the moderates still have a toehold is in the state Senate, where they combine with the Democrats and are, I don't know, how many Democrats are in the Kansas State Senate now, like 4?
7 out of 4.
Yeah, 7. And they combine with the moderates, and they're sometimes able to stop the freight train. But it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. I have a friend who's an editor of a French newspaper, and he comes over every 4 years to go to the political conventions, and I go with him, and we have a good time. And last time he came over, we drove around West Virginia, because he wanted to see a blue-collar area turning conservative. He thought this was such an interesting phenomenon, and so we went to West Virginia, and I made him listen to Rush Limbaugh the whole time on the car radio, and I took him to Walmart and this kind of thing, and he would say, I come over here every 4 years, and every 4 years you've gotten worse. And he's right. It's so what's still the matter with it? Look, somebody the other day asked me why me describing it didn't by itself alter the situation, why observation didn't alter the observed, And the thing is that it's going to take a lot more than like somebody writing a clever book about it to change what goes on there. I think that, you're asking the biggest question of them all. Why, there's a line in Kansas that I go back to a lot in What's the Matter with Kansas, where I said that out here, the gravity of discontent pulls to the right and further to the right. And we're all Kansans now in that respect. If you're angry, if you're bitter, if you're discontented, organized discontent, who's doing that? It's not my friends, over at Center for American Progress. It's not the liberals who are doing that. It's the right. They have got a message for you. They've got a movement for you. They are so angry, They've got enough, what was the line? They've got enough rage to give everyone in America apoplexy, They're, and at the end of the day, I think that there's reason to be angry in America. I've been talking about, the sort of gaping divide between the classes now for 10 years. And I come across as a nice person, and I tell lots of jokes and everything like that. But I think that this is a situation that ought to inspire outrage. And there is no sort of organized way of reaching out to that outrage from my side. Okay, there used to be, and the most obvious example was organized labor, But go back to my friend driving around in West Virginia, and we're listening on the radio to Rush Limbaugh, and he's like Glenn Beck, he's mad all the time. He doesn't have the doom fixation, but he's mad all the time, and he speaks to your outrage. And if you are angry in a small town in West Virginia or Wichita, Kansas, who is going to speak? And everybody's angry. Come on, these are hard times. You're watching epic theft, first from Wall Street, then from our Treasury Department. You can't believe what's going on. And who speaks to it? In your town, what presence speaks to it? There's only one, and it's talk radio. Once upon a time, there was organized labor. Every town in America had this other voice that you had to listen to. And they would be out there talking about this sort of thing. And that's completely silenced everywhere you go in this country. And it leaves essentially only one voice.
What's the cause of the decline of organized labor and the decline of the relationship between liberals and organized labor?
Well, these are
two questions.
These are two, but these are things that are interrelated. Organized labor, it hasn't so much declined as it's been beaten. My friend Tom Gagan used to, the labor lawyer in Chicago, who's written one of the greatest books about the decline of labor. It's called Which Side Are You On? You should have him in here one of these days. He's a wonderful speaker. And he used to always point out to that they do opinion polls all the time of workers and ask them would they like to be a member of a union. I mean, generally speaking, you know, everybody in America, blue-collar people just across the board. And I don't remember the numbers now, but it's much higher. What is the percentage of organized workers in the private sector? It's below 7% now. It's something crazy like that. It's incredibly small. But the number of people who would like to be a member of a union, last time I looked, it was around 50%. It's probably lower than that now. Now, if you change the question and take the word union out of it and just say, well, would you like to be able to negotiate with your boss over the conditions of employment? It's like 90%. You know, everybody wants that. It's like, duh. You know, of course. They can't have it. The reason they can't have it is because it's incredibly easy to defeat labor organizing campaigns, and it's also incredibly easy to threaten the. They've done studies of this, of how many, when you try to organize a workplace, how does management react? You can threaten to move the plant to Mexico. You can fire the ringleaders. You can do all these things, and there's very little enforcement. I mean, things that are against the law, there's very little enforcement. This is what happens in America.
There's nobody more anti-union, I think, than the typical liberal these days.
Why do you think that? I'm liberal.
Barack Obama said it in his own book, and you quote him as saying it.
Ah, yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, sorry.
No, you threw me off there.
Sorry to quote your own book at you.
No, but that's exactly right. This is okay, and Walter makes this an important point here. If you go back and read The Audacity of Hope, there's this passage, very telling passage, where Barack Obama is describing his own thinking as he's running for the Senate in Illinois. And he talks about the kind of people, running for Senate is an expensive proposition. Running for president, even more expensive. And he talks about the kind of people that you had to go to raise money. You have to raise money if you're going to run for the Senate. And they tend to be, in the financiers, people like that. Very wealthy personally, and he said that they all sort of fit they all sort of fit this particular profile. They tended to be very liberal on social issues, nice, good liberals on social issues. They thought that all our ills could be solved by, kids getting a better education, going to college, that kind of thing. They believed in markets. They hated organized labor. And they believed in free trade. Okay, so in important respects, they are identical to the Tea Party movement, And then Barack Obama appends this very revealing line after it: as I talked to these people more and raised money from them more, I could feel myself becoming more like them. And that's exactly right. That is exactly what he has become.
Yes. And then I'll go back. Way back.
Hi, Ricardo Ernst. I'm a professor at Georgetown University. I have a question. You have been talking a lot about the U.S. and the 30s and the situation we're facing now. One dimension you haven't covered, I would like to know your take on that, is the global view. I mean, the U.S. is not an isolated entity, and now we are much more involved in you can call it globalization if you want to go that way or not, but I would like to know what is your take on the other dimension, the other variables, again, in the definition of all these labels that we are creating today, and the word global or globalization has not been mentioned by you. I mean, I don't know if you have a particular take on that.
Well, I do have a particular take on globalization in that it's a concept that gets used for this purpose and that, but it's not something that Tom Friedman uses it to mean one thing, somebody else uses it to mean something else. The aspects of this, I mean, obviously the financial crisis this time around began with America and then went elsewhere in the world. Or you had countries that were following our economic model, like Iceland, who got badly burned by doing so. And ironically, the U.S. has, even though I've spent the last hour complaining, about how our sort of ironic response to the crisis, the U.S. has responded a lot better than the European nations, in my view. Well, actually, Iceland has had a good response, but you look at the European nations, which are heading into this austerity trap, God, that I wrote about in the Wall Street Journal now 2 years ago. It just gets worse and worse and worse and worse as they clamp down and clamp down and clamp down, drive their economies deeper into recession, and then wonder why their tax revenues are decreasing and they can't pay their they can't, and they slide deeper into debt. And I think that aspect of it may very well be coming back to haunt us real soon. But it's interesting to me in the sense that globalization. Globalization works for someone who wants to say move their factory to to China or something like that. But it doesn't work in the sense that our politicians cannot seem to learn anything from the disaster that is going on before our eyes over in Europe. As the austerity plunges these countries deeper into recession, and we have politicians in this country that demanding. I mean, they think it's not even worth debating. Of course, you have to tackle the federal deficit right now. Romney actually was nailing Santorum for this the other day, that Santorum hasn't been a hardliner on the debt ceiling. So I'm bringing it back to America because that's what I really want to talk about. But I was astonished by that you'd think they'd want to have their distance from the debt ceiling showdown last summer, which was so frightening, and yet Romney is claiming that Santorum isn't a hard line enough on he isn't into austerity enough. But there's a case of globalization just failing to globalize.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Robert Schlesinger with U.S. News and World Report. On the question of the left reaching out to or tapping into the anger out there, what do you make of the Occupy 99% movement?
Well, I'll tell you the first
Good
time
question.
it is a good question, and the first time I saw I heard about it, and by the way, that movement basically started up almost immediately after I turned the book in. So they make, I think, one appearance in the book where I reference them in passing. But I thought the 99%, I am the 99% online protest was really effective. I was bowled over by that. Now, occupying public parks and things like that as a strategy, I don't know how far that's going to take someone. What has to happen is they have to build a movement, and they have to become relevant to people all over this country in terms of their everyday lives. That's what I really liked about I Am the 99%. That was people everywhere. And that was an example, by the way, one of the first really good examples of online protest being effective. I mean, the other thing that you have to remember is that that's just what we saw last fall is just a beginning. It has to go much further. And so we're all waiting to see what happens in the spring.
Thank you. Jonathan Rausch of Brookings. I'm a journalist based in Washington. So assuming that Barack Obama is not the fighting liberal or fighting progressive you were hoping for, how much difference would it make if progressives were to find a fighting voice, or is the public simply not very receptive to it right now? And by the way, do you see any such voices out there?
It's funny that the phrase "fighting liberal." We're going back to the 30s again here. You know who they used to call the fighting liberal? It was George Norris from Nebraska, Republican. Mm-hmm. That's it, just give you an idea. A little reminder of how much things have changed in 80 years. I think that a fighting progressive voice would be really powerful at the moment. And I think that Barack Obama is starting to figure that out, and you see him starting to adopt those tones. It may be too little, too late, and he may not be the right bearer for that kind of message. I mean, he's always been this sort of cool academic type. He always references expertise. That's the kind of person that he is. It's not something that comes to him naturally. But of course, I think that would be that's exactly what we need. You know who I think is I like Trumka. I think Trumka is really awesome, but of course he's not a politician. I think Elizabeth Warren is really good, and I like her especially when I found out that she was a high school debater in Oklahoma. Yeah. I was a high school debater in Kansas. We used to debate the teams from Oklahoma, but there are a couple voices out there that I think are very relevant and very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Is that Bill? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Bill Nitzo, trustee of the Institute. You've partially explained a dilemma that I have been unable to resolve. I accept that there is a growing cultural divide in the country, or there has been a cultural divide that has become exacerbated. But it seems to me that many lower middle class people are supporting positions that are directly contrary to not only to their own economic interests, but to the future of their children and grandchildren.
That's the theme of his
Now,
Kansas
I
book,
accept a certain level of irrationality. But to believe that giving billionaires, you know, their next $2 billion, or to think that the rapture is coming, or to believe that being angry will somehow transform the world, these are positions that are so irrational, so contrary to a tradition of American pragmatism and common sense, so violently different from the centrist reformist movements which working class people have supported in the past, that it's as if people had somehow lost their heads, as if a huge Kool-Aid incident had happened. And I wonder if you can explain this to me.
All right, I like that phrase.
And you get to buy all the books by since they tried to explain this.
A Kool-Aid incident. Okay, that's right. And I've now written about this several times, and I swear I'm never going to write about it again.
1930s is your next book, right?
No. I'm done.
Oh.
I'm retiring. To beautiful Bethesda.
Okay.
It's only irrational, I think, if people have all the choices and all the information spread before them and make the wrong choice. And that's not what's happening. There's, by and large, we're talking about the sort of presence of certain voices in communities and the absence of others. And I didn't talk enough about the real failure of Democrats or of liberals, of my team, to make any kind of arguments to counter the Tea Party movement, or even to promote promote the things that they themselves wanted to do. Okay, another place where this book began, one of the sort of seeds of this book, is I was listening to a town hall. You remember Town Hall Summer 2009? Mm-hmm. And I was listening to one of these town hall meetings on a satellite, or not satellite, what do they call it? Yeah, satellite radio. I was way out in the middle of nowhere in Washington State. And I was listening to a town hall meeting of this audience getting angrier and angrier at their, senator, who was a Democrat, who was there to talk to them about the Democrats' health care plan, universal health care. Okay, now this is a party that is proposing, a grand sort of expansion of social insurance in the middle of economic catastrophe. It should not be a hard sell. It should not be a difficult sell to make, This should be something that goes down pretty easily. And instead they're faced with this, massive uprising, people showing up at these meetings and screaming and yelling and saying, what about freedom? What about liberty? They always want to have this debate on the most basic terms. Now I'm listening to this guy on the radio talking to his constituents, and that's what they're saying. One after another, people are getting up and yelling, what about our freedom? And he doesn't have an answer. He can't explain why we need to have, how social insurance enhances freedom, how equality actually expands. This is like what Franklin Roosevelt was all about, the 4 freedoms. Remember, freedom from want. They cannot. Today's Democrats cannot talk about that. Another example. They're doing the stimulus. What? Do I have a theory why? Yes, I'll get to it in a second. The stimulus package. Okay, when this turned out to be extremely controversial. I don't think Barack Obama thought it was going to be controversial when he proposed it. Remember, he wanted to get 80 votes in the Senate. He wanted a majority of the Republicans to back it too. Of course, that didn't come to pass, and the Democrats had to pass it all by themselves. And when they went to explain it, they said, well, we're doing this because the economists tell us we need to do it. Okay? It's just not a very convincing way, to always fall back on expertise, which is what they do when they're talking about the health care, when they're talking about the deficit spending. Everything that they do, they're like, we're doing this because the experts tell us we have to do it this way. And they do that. They talk that way because that's who the Democrats are. They are, nowadays, they are largely a party of, and they understand themselves this way, of professionals and of professional classes and of expertise in academia. And that's why when Santorum calls Obama a snob yesterday for proposing universal college, he's not just completely full of shit. Am I allowed to say that? He's not just completely full of it. There is something there, okay? Because this is what the Democrats are about nowadays, is about this appeal, constantly appealing to expertise. They cannot give you the ideological or political reasons why we need to do these things. They can only tell you that the experts say we need to do them. And that's just not very convincing. And so when you have your average voter sitting in the audience at this town hall meeting, and he wants to know about his freedom, and the guy dodges the question and bobs and weaves and won't give him a straightforward answer, and in fact, no Democrat will come out there and tell him why, this actually, grows our freedom, expands our freedom. No one will make that argument. What's he supposed to think? When it's always just disappeal, and oh God, and the bailouts were the worst of all. We're doing this because we're experts. We know, and it's obvious to everyone in America that these are cronies bailing out cronies. These are friends bailing out their buddies, and they're talking about expertise. Never has this system been more, patently hollow. But they cannot give you an explanation for it that's anything more. But the Republicans, oh my God, not the Republicans. There's a lot of Republicans who don't fit my analysis. The conservatives, the Tea Partiers, man, they've got it all figured out for you. And they've got an explanation. And it's about this, living up to our promise, the promise of America, which is markets. America is about markets, and the closer we get to that ideal, the more American we are, and the more true we are to our natures, and the more true we are to God's holy plan. And this is, in an era like this, that is really powerful. And when it goes up against nothing, it's extremely powerful. That's the whole problem here. This is, I know it's time I should shut up. I've spent 10 years now writing books and articles making fun of the right wing in America. And all those years, the right wing has grown more and more and more powerful. And look, it's my career, and I have a blast doing it, and it's a hoot. And I've made a career out of it. But what this stuff is more powerful than is nothing. It's more power. If you have on the one hand these sort of silly messages that go around in circles like a dog chasing its tail, and have these visions of the free market that are patently false when you talk about everyday reality, all of that stuff, it's better than nothing. And nothing is what they get from the Democrats. And that's it.
For more, read Pity the Billionaire. It's out there for sale. Thomas will sign it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Here's my counter-argument to that. Which I will do it with the microphone off.